Women are like dogs. We need to be groomed. Shampoo, condition, blow dry, fluffy. Guys, you're like cats. You're like, what? I'm dirty? Oh, I'm dirty. Let's go. Thank you.
Okay, I thought we could all use a little giggle. She got a standing O, obviously. But I thought that was pretty funny because a lot of it's so true. Can I go? Can I go? Can I go? Women are...
I hope this speaks to the here at all, but it's kind of actually true.
It is. I think that was the funny part.
Yeah, but I can't say that's true entirely, though.
Right.
Because I know, like, for myself, I'm more of, like she referred to as adult. I mean, I am more all that line versus being a cat. Yes.
Oh, you're not emotionally unavailable and aloof?
No, I mean, when I met my wife, and that was a big change. Like,
yeah.
Initially, I mean, I was more along the lines of a cat because I just talk to anybody, but kind of keep to myself. When she came along, it was like immediately, it was like a change. And I mean, I've known her for a year now. We've been married since June of this year.
Newlyweds! I love it.
For us, honestly, I mean, we talked about it on the ride down already. We talked about it. She's like, well, how does it feel being together for a year? And I was like, I love it. I mean, we have our, quirks and stuff that we have to work out with each other, but we've never had, like, a full-on argument, like, where it's my way or the highway kind of thing. Her and I, we sit and talk, we communicate effectively, and it works, and we get through everything that comes up. I mean, we've had a lot of issues pop up for us over the past 6 months, but nothing stops us from, being respectful to each other, being loving to each other, and caring for each other. I mean, she's down, I got her back, I take care of her, and if I get down, or upset about something, she's right there. She'll take care of me. She works with me, and especially with my PTSD.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest one. Like when her and I first met, my PTSD was fucking good.
Yeah.
I was having severe issues.
Yeah, it doesn't really solve the problem.
Since her and I've been together, it's like that issue has it's slowed down a lot, calmed down a lot. I mean, I still have my issues here and there, especially when I'm driving.
Yeah.
I'm able to actually go into stores now. Like, as long as I have her with me, I'm fine. But, I'll have my issues. If I go down an aisle and there's, 50 fucking people just standing there talking, I won't go down and she's like, just stay here until I get right back. She'll go get me.
Well, you know what? That's called a partnership. And that's, that all that is you guys are utilizing each other's strengths and helping each other out with them. And that's the way it should be. And that's absolutely the way it should be. And, I'm married too, and he's a wonderful man, and we try to utilize each other's strengths. There's stuff he's smarter about, there's stuff I'm smarter about. It's just the way it is.
Yep.
And we take care of each other. Really, honestly, that whole thing was more of a joke than anything else. But men who I have found, though, however, when men are single, they are like cats.
Yes, I will agree to that. When a guy's single, a guy will, and there are women out there that do the same thing.
Yes.
And I've noticed it. But it's all about how a guy is single. He'll go out and he's more like a tomcat.
Yeah.
He'll go out, he'll do his thing, and have fun with it.
Yeah.
And keep to himself, man. He'll be respectful here. He'll go out and tap a few asses and be done.
Yeah, right? Oh, it's true. There's some women like that too. I'm gonna go tap that ass and I'm going home, or he needs to get out. Bye.
But when a guy, like in my situation, finds the right person,
Yeah.
everything changes. Everything changes. And it's fucking awesome. I love it.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It is awesome, and I'm really glad you found the right person. But caveat, we had a little fun break. But I got this guy on here that's talking about the truth about gun control. Basically he's given some facts about what's going on with actual gun control, and I think this plays off of what the other young lady was talking about pretty well.
Staggering, if not downright, of biblical proportions. We're going to cut through all of that clutter with some original research that will show you the actual facts about gun control And when you see the actual facts about gun control, you'll see why nobody wants to talk about it. But let's dive straight in to the data. So, in gun control, a litmus test of somebody's honesty when discussing the data is whether they talk about homicides or gun deaths. Now, gun deaths, of course, are any death that results from the use of a gun. As you can see from this chart, 2012 data, 62% of gun deaths in the United States are suicides. That seems quite important. Only 35% of them are homicides. Mixing these two together is lying. And, of course, that's quite a lot of what occurs in this area. Suicides, of course, doing unto yourself. Homicides, doing unto others. If doing to yourself is exactly the same as doing unto others, I was a total stud in junior high school. That's why I got carpal tunnel syndrome. So, now, maybe you say, well, let's ban guns so that there are fewer suicides, because they're used a lot in suicides. Well, the data denies you there. I'm afraid you are fact-blocked. In the United States, 51% of suicides are achieved with a firearm, 24% by hanging or suffocation. Now, in the United Kingdom, where handguns are generally banned, only 2% of suicides are achieved through firearms, but 60% through hanging or suffocation. Just think of society like a balloon. You know, you push in one end, the other end just bulges out. Get rid of guns, people will kill themselves some other way. Aha, you may say. But the United Kingdom has only half the suicide rate of the United States. That is true. However, if we go to South Korea, which has the second highest suicide rate in the world, and where handguns are banned, people kill themselves 60% of the time using pesticides. So it doesn't really matter. People who want to kill themselves are going to find a way to kill themselves. Otherwise, it's ban bridges. And then we've got to get very wet. So let's look at how criminals get guns. See, if you make guns illegal, people who don't follow the law might still get a hold of them. I mean, why do people even need to ask this question? Hey, remember how they banned marijuana and how it's impossible to get marijuana and therefore there is no such thing as a Cheech and Chong film? Yeah, I didn't think so. They can't even keep drugs out of prisons. You turn all of society into a prison, people are still going to find a way to get what they want. So this was a survey of inmates and firearm sources. 40% came from illegal sources. And that's theft, a drug dealer off the street, a black market, and so on. 37.4% of inmates got their gun from family or friend. Because, you know, what kind of friend are you if you let your criminal friend wander around unarmed? A bad friend, I guess. 11.3 got those through a legal purchase. In other words, they went through a background check. 0.8% got them from gun shows where background checks are usually not performed. And 11.2% got them from other. So...
And all this says to me is that people are very ignorant to the fact that your law-abiding citizen is going to be the one that doesn't have a gun because it's been banned, but the fucking criminals will. All right, let's carry on.
You're really not going to do much good by banning guns. Let's look at Australia. In 1996, the Australian government introduced very strict gun control legislation after two things. One, a massacre in Tasmania, and two, realizing that most people there are descended from criminals. So let's take them away. Now, firearm homicides did decline sharply immediately afterwards, but overall, homicide rates did not change until 2001, when they began to trend downwards as part of a worldwide trend of a reduction of this kind of violence. Now, as you can see from the graph, as firearm use in homicides declined, the use of knives and other sharp objects increased. Now, shockingly, there is pretty good data to suggest that you're about as likely to die from a knife wound as you are from a gunshot wound, especially handguns. They're pretty small. So, yeah, it doesn't really solve the problem. You just get more knives and sharp instruments being used to kill people rather than firearms. Now, according to the theory, more guns is more crime, and therefore if we want to reduce crime, less guns, okay? Let's put that to the test. It's not really a very complicated test, but we'll do it anyway. U.S. homicide rate from 1994 to 2012 declines from 9 to a little under 5. So that must mean that the number of guns has been declining enormously, right? No, way more guns now than there were in 1994, and a far lower homicide rate. So according to one estimate, 286 million guns in the U.S. in 2011. Other estimates place that as high as 334 million, which is more guns than people. So this data should give anyone pause when it comes. I want to say this is correlation. Nobody's saying there's direct causation here, although there are arguments that the more prevalent their guns are, the less safe criminals feel and the fewer crimes are committed. And there are estimates that say that as many as 2.5 million crimes in the U.S. are prevented because people are armed. But this should give you pause if you think that reducing guns will automatically reduce homicides, because there seems to be some other factor at play here. All right. If we think that more guns is more homicides, let's look at the top states by murder rate. Let's count the District of Columbia as a state rather than the center of evil. So let's compare gun ownership. This is from 2002. So the national average gun ownership percentage is 32.6% of people. Murder rate per 100,000, 5.64. Now, the District of Columbia has very, very few guns. And it's only 5.2% gun ownership, which is way, way less. And that's 6 times less than the national average. So therefore, the murder rate should be totally low. According to the theory, not the case. The murder rate is far higher in the District of Columbia than it is nationally, 8 times, 9 times higher. Despite a 5.2% gun ownership percentage, it's a 46.2 murder rate per 100,000. Louisiana, boy, that's high gun ownership, 45.6. Oh, murder rate much lower than the District of Columbia, which has a much lower firearm or gun ownership rate, 13.2. Maryland, 22.1%. Gun ownership, 9.4% homicide. Mississippi, 54.3% gun ownership. Hey, those frogs aren't going to shoot themselves. And 9.2% murder rate. No correlation there. Nevada, 31.5% gun ownership, murder rate per 100,000, 8.3. And if you take out the back alleys behind casinos, that's a lot lower. New Mexico, 39.6% gun ownership, 8.3% murder rate. Illinois, 19.7% gun ownership, 7.5% murder rate. South Carolina, casinos, that's a lot lower.
All that, so I'm going.
Murder rate. Illinois, 19.7% gun ownership, 7.5% murder rate. 0.2 to 7.1. So as you can see, no particular correlation.
The last one was Arizona.
So, Firearms Control Regulations Act of 1975 banned Washington, D.C. residents from owning handguns, automatic firearms, and high-capacity semi-automatic firearms. About 10 years later, crime in D.C. began to skyrocket, and by the 1990s, the area became known as the murder capital of the United States.
Yes.
Now, of course, there was a crack epidemic in the 80s, but here we see there's a firearm ban, doesn't seem to have much to do with the murder rate, and then the murder rate skyrockets despite the firearm ban. Something else at play here. As to why the murder rate began to decline in the 90s, well, there's a number of arguments. Stronger sentencing and not letting criminals out. You know, in the 1960s, there was kind of a revolving door policy put in by the leftists, which was, you know, well, criminals are victims and it's socioeconomic status and Marxist economic determinism, so let's let the poor people out, the poor criminals out, and therefore they went and committed more crimes. Also, there's an argument to be made that the legalization of abortion in the 1970s, 16 to 20 years later, produced far fewer feral young men raised in fatherless homes and therefore much higher propensity towards criminality. So, doesn't really matter. Murder rate and gun ownership by state. Let's look at all the states and the murder rate. And gun ownership percentage on the y-axis here. The higher the gun ownership, you'd expect the higher the murder rate. It's not the case. There's a slightly negative correlation. So 1.0 is a perfect correlation. Minus 1.0 is a perfectly negative correlation. 0 is no correlation at all. This is basically 0. There's no hang on to your head. 7, nothing particularly significant. So this is not the pattern for 100,000. 2014, Baltimore had a murder rate of 33.8 per 100,000. Now, Maryland has very strict gun control laws. Very high murder rate. The same year, Memphis also had a murder rate of 21.4 compared to the 4.5 national average. Now, Tennessee gun control laws are a lot less restrictive compared to Maryland. The murder rate is also very high, close to 4 times the national average. Portland, 4.2 murder rate, which is even below the national average.